Welcome back. I will now start the second half of our symposium, and it's great to be able to introduce Garrett Knapp, somebody that I'm deeply indebted to. For example, I still owe him a case of beer from the last time I accepted a bet about his Oregon Ducks and my Washington Huskies. So we went to school, I went to a slightly better school than he did, but they've been getting the better of us on the football field. So, no, Garrett, when I was in graduate school, Garrett was the guy that we all wanted to be. So he's sort of a rock star in urban planning. So I'm very pleased to introduce him.
So too kind, John. Thanks very much. It's great to be here. This interface of planning and economics is really where I live. I have 3 degrees in economics, but I spent my entire career in planning. So this is really a great place to be. And it's tough to follow Jan, right? Jan and I have been sparring for a long time, as he said. One of the first things I did when I was an assistant professor at the University of Illinois was sit through Jan's urban economics course, and it was certainly one of the best courses I've ever taken, and it's shaped my thinking ever since. So it's great to be like Jan. I respect him so much, I've now tried to look like him. Lost all my hair and even took on part of his name. So that's great to be here with Jan. Of course, it's great to be here with Jan, too. We have a prime imperative at the National Center for Smart Growth, which is make Garrett Knapp look good. And as my former student, Jan has done this as good as anybody. So I'm really grateful to Jan and pleased to be here with her. And John Carruthers, I mean, come on. He's got the best hair in the academy, right? So if Justin Bieber ever needs a replacement, we've got John Carruthers. And yes, because I live in this field, right, I don't mind hawking this book. This is the Oxford Handbook of Urban Economics and Planning, right? And there are many pieces in here by planners and economists where, again, this interface lives. So drop $180 at your bookstore and pick up a copy, even if it's not economical. So here's my talk. So sustainable communities, the role of planning in economics. So like I said, I live at this interface. And a little bit different from Jan, I think, is, what we do at the center is use economic analysis to inform planning, right? So we'll certainly analyze the consequences of planning. And my first sort of foray into Washington when I got here was an article about the urban reserve, the rural reserve in Montgomery County that Royce may remember. And it was sort of a call, and I was still an economist, still a recovering economist at the time. And the Washington Post calls me and talks to me about the rural reserve and the danger of losing it and so forth. And I said, well, the problem with food in this country is that we have too much of it, not too little, right? Which is the wrong quote to sort of come out with as a new director of the National Center for Smart Growth. But in any case, so I've learned my ways, okay, and I've learned to operate a little bit more effectively at this interface, a little bit more polish, I think, on my interactions with both the community and with the press. So I'm going to talk about a project that we're working on. It's called, this is the top of this thing is a little off, Sustainable and Equitable Economic Development. Right? And the point is that we are trying to promote sustainable and equitable economic development. So this is our mission. Right? But our mission, at least from my point of view, is to do it in an informed way. Right? So let's use our analytical skills, our economic skills, both from a theoretical side, from an empirical side, to try to do this better. And one of the reasons that we have so many partners in this is because one of the things we really try to do at the Smart Growth Center is to transfer the information that we gain immediately into the policymaking world. So in one sense that happens because I'm on the Smart Growth Subcabinet and I'm on the Sustainable Growth Commission in the state of Maryland, but also because we're working with these partners. So this is a project funded by the CERTNA Foundation, and we have these advocacy organizations who are our partners as well as the Maryland Department of Planning. So the idea being that the information that we generate gets transferred rather quickly and immediately into the policymaking process and into the advocacy process. So I'm going to talk about Maryland, and I'm going to talk about some economic issues in Maryland. And in the first place, like I said, this topic and this project is really about economic development. So one place to start is with some understanding of the economic structure of the state of Maryland. And I think it is quite different. Here's where I would differ with Chris a little bit. This region really is quite different from other regions in the country, okay? And so this is, it describes the structure, economic structure of Maryland. And Maryland is a very blue state, right? The blue colors here are industries in which the location quotient is greater than 1, right? Which means we have a greater share of employment in these industries than the rest of the country. And the red is less than 1. So Maryland is a blue state, right? So, federal government is where we live, so to speak, and that's not true of other parts of the country, right? We also have our eds and meds, right? This is, again, a real strength of Maryland. We have construction and we have professional services. We don't have so much management, we don't have a whole lot of mining, and we don't have much manufacturing. There's a lot of folks at Brookings, for example, starting to talk about, reinvesting in manufacturing. Frankly, I don't think that's such a good idea. Right? There's very little evidence to suggest that manufacturing is coming back in the state of Maryland in particular. So, some understanding of the industrial specialization of the state of Maryland. Right? This is a graph that illustrates two things. One is the location quotients, once again, on the vertical, actually three things. Location quotients on the vertical axis, which reflects some of the data I had earlier. And on the horizontal axis is the growth from 1990 to 2010 of these various industries. And the size of the ball is the size of employment, okay? So generally, or some people, when they look at data like this, they say, well, what you want are industries in which you have some comparative advantage and industries in which there is the prospect for continuing growth, and that's the upper right-hand quadrant. Right? So in the state of Maryland, it's government, quite obviously, professional and scientific, educational services, health and social services. Right? It is the eds and meds and government. Right? This is where we live in Maryland, partly because we're part of this Washington metropolitan region. And that is different from other parts of the country. The good news about that is these are industries that are not only growing, but lend itself better to sort of transit-oriented development and the kind of spatial structure that is the kind of structure that smart growth advocates prefer, right? You can talk about the automobile industry in Detroit. It's not the same as government in Washington, D.C. Right? You're not going to put automobile plants around transit stations, right? Whereas in the state of Maryland, we have the kind of economic structure where this kind of location orientation makes some sense. Now, I've got graphs like this for all different parts of the state of Maryland. The other point I want to make without giving you all the graphics is this looks quite different in different parts of the state. All right, so Baltimore area looks quite different. Still a lot of eds and meds in Baltimore, but not nearly the government and certainly not the federal government. Western Maryland looks entirely different. All right, there is some manufacturing in Western Maryland. And on the Eastern Shore, it's once again entirely different. So proposing economic development policies, I would argue, requires a little bit of information of what the underlying economic structure is and the direction that the economy is going. So drilling down a little bit now to look at the spatial structure of the Maryland economy, we've sometimes called this Maryland's 1%. All right? These are similar to the growth centers that Chris Leinberger identified, but what we've done is identified them empirically. Not based on urban form, walkable urban, right? But we're looking at where the job concentration. Right? So we've identified places, transportation analysis zones, where the employment density is greater than 10 jobs per acre, and the combined employment of all the contiguous TAZs have more than 10,000 employees. Right? And so here they are, and they're not actually quite that different from what Chris presented. So obviously the 270 corridor, the Route 1 corridor, downtown Baltimore, Towson up above. We got our Fort Meade, we got Annapolis, and we got Frederick. So I mean, if you're from this area, I think this map will look somewhat familiar, and you'll see, understand what these economic centers are. So we describe these as the economic engines of the state of Maryland. So a little bit about the nature of these centers. So if you look at the left-hand column here, these are the employment data about the centers, the employment that occurs within the center. So the percent of firms in the state that are in the centers is roughly a quarter. Right? So a fourth of all the firms in the state are located in these centers. 40% of the employment of the state is located in these centers. And remember, this constitutes 1.18% of the land. So again, this is quite similar to what Chris is talking about. We have tremendous concentration on a small proportion of the land. Right? Also within these centers, we see that the average number of jobs is greater than outside the centers, 31 employees per firm rather than 17 employees per firm. And roughly 11,000 if you divide the number of employees by the quarterly wage, 12,000 versus 8,000. So about a 35% wage premium for people who work in these centers compared to people who don't work in these centers. Some brief characterization of these employment centers. Downtown Baltimore is still still has the most employment in the region, within the state, I should say. But the next two you see, we split up the 270 corridor into Bethesda, North Bethesda, and Rockville, Gaithersburg, Germantown. If you put those two together, they are bigger than downtown Baltimore. Now, I think this is really important because we are engaged in a number of planning areas, a number of planning endeavors in the state of Maryland. One is the Baltimore Regional Sustainability Planning effort that many of you probably heard about, and the other is Plan Maryland. And if you look at that map I showed you, in Maryland, all roads will lead to Baltimore. And so if you have a transportation system which is very much focused on downtown Baltimore, and the economic engine that was downtown Baltimore is no longer your economic engine, you probably need to rethink the relationship between your transportation center and where you're trying to get folks, and the coordination of economic development policy and transportation policy. You can see also that this follows very much sort of the curve that we would expect in central place theory in the distribution of employment across the state of Maryland. One of the things that we also looked at for each of these centers was the diversity of industries. We computed Herfindahl indices. Notice our focus is really much more on the economic structure of these things rather than the physical structure. We're not worried about whether these are walkable urban places. We're looking at what the economic structure of these places are. And one of the interesting things I think about if you look at this diversity measure is that they're all relatively diverse. Right? We expected to find that there was going to be a major concentration of activity at one center versus another center, right? So that you'd have, let's say, high tech in the 270 corridor, and you'd have manufacturing in other parts of the state. And it's not true. Right? What we find is all these centers are really quite diverse. The only ones that are not diverse is Fort Meade, right, which is very military dominated, Linthicum Heights, which is right by BWI Airport, which has a lot of manufacturing, and Woodlawn in Baltimore, which has a major Social Security Administration facility, so that's once again not as diverse as the rest of them, but the rest of them really quite diverse. Another important feature of these centers is that they play a disproportionate role in the transportation system. So if we look at, first of all, we have the number of households and employment once again, but in these centers, right, roughly 21% of all trips produced and 28% of all the trips attracted. Right? This is morning peak, so you get more attractions than generation. 20% of the auto trips and 40% of the transit trips. Right? So if you're interested in focusing your economy and your economic development on transit, it makes sense to focus some of your efforts on these centers because people take transit to these centers disproportionately. This graph is not center-specific, but it's one of the outputs of our transportation model that we have built for the state of Maryland, and it breaks down trip distribution by trip type and by mode. Okay, so here's rail, bus, high occupancy vehicle, which really means at least two people in the car. Okay, and single occupant vehicle, home-based to work trips, home-based shopping trips, home-based other trips, home-based school trips, non-home-based work trips, and other-based other. Right? So it's by type of trip. Right? The first thing you'll notice is that transit, and we know this to be true, is a relatively small share of all trips. Okay? And a single-occupant vehicle, particularly for many of the trip types, remains the dominant transportation mode choice. If we look at where the rail transit, however, is the largest share, you can see that it is in the work-based, right, the home-based work, the travel to work, and it is the trips that you take from work. Right? So if you have a lot of concentration of activity in these centers, you're going to likely get more transportation mode choice by transit. The other point to be made here that isn't shown on this graph is there's actually quite a bit of difference in the income distribution of travel by mode. Right? So we know that relatively high-income people are more likely to take rail transit and lower-income people are more likely to take bus transit. Partly has to do with the fare, but it also has to do with the distribution of jobs. Right? So if the jobs in professional, in eds and meds and so forth are located in these centers, it tends to be high-income people that take the transit to get to those centers, and the lower-skilled jobs tend to be much more widely distributed, and so it's people taking bus to get to those centers, those economic centers. All right, just to give you a little bit of the flavor, and Tracy made this point a little bit earlier about, where do people work that come to the centers. This is the Bethesda, North Bethesda Center, all right, and the outlines of these are weird shaped because they're transportation analysis zones, and so they don't match up with reality in any nice way. But this is the center, and the transit 30-mile trip is in gold, right? And you'll notice it's not very big. All right. Now this is, again, output from our travel model, so it includes the time it takes to get from your home to the transit station and from the transit station to your place of work. And if you think about how much time it takes to do that, you can't get very far in a half an hour. Anytime I come down here, for example, I've got to budget an hour from College Park. It may not take me an hour, but I better budget an hour because it may take me an hour. All right. So how far I can get from College Park in a half hour by transit really isn't very far. If you expand that to 45 minutes, however, it expands quite a bit further, right? Partly because the fixed costs are already there, and if you stay on the train or if you stay on the bus for another 15 minutes, you can get quite a bit farther because you've already sunk the cost into getting to the rail or to the bus and getting from the bus to your place of work. So it expands quite a bit when you expand it to 45 minutes relative to a half an hour. If you go by car, however, right, the transit shed or the commute shed expands tremendously. Right, so you can get to Bethesda, North Bethesda, from almost anywhere in the northern part of the district and almost anywhere in Montgomery County by car. And if you go to 45 minutes, right, the commute shed really tremendously expands. Okay, so it makes probably some sense to try to balance jobs in households as best you can in small areas, but you're never likely to succeed at doing that, right? And I'll bet you Jan could come up with a very fancy econometric model that says that, look, if you try to put everybody in this center and balance jobs housing, some people are going to increase their utility by moving a little bit further, even though their travel time hasn't fallen very much, and they might take it a different mode. So that's not to say you shouldn't have to pursue jobs housing balance in a small area, but you're really swimming upstream when you're trying to do that, right? Because the commute shed really is quite large. The other point we make, and I'm only showing you the North Bethesda commute shed, is when you think about jobs housing balance, we think commute sheds are really probably the best geography for thinking about that. You think about jobs housing balance, people try to think about it in terms of census tracts, in terms of political boundaries in Montgomery County, for example, or in the district. Probably doesn't make that much sense to think about it that way. However, we think about a half-hour commute shed, and you think about what's the jobs housing balance, that might be a way to think about how you actually try to balance jobs and housing. One way to illustrate that is by computing jobs housing balance in these various centers. And here are the centers. Right? You can see some have jobs housing balances that are really jobs to households that are really high. And that's not surprising because that's how we define these centers. Right? We pick the centers that have really high job densities. And so the likelihood of a very high ratio of jobs to housing is going to be really high. And some of them are really quite high. Right? Fort Meade, for example, you got a lot of jobs there. It's a military installation, and you don't have a lot of housing there, at least not non-military housing. So you get really high job housing ratios. And inside the centers, you got what are historically and sort of by rule of thumb extremely high jobs housing ratios. As you expand, however, you can see that the jobs housing ratio declines and comes much more into what is usually considered to be balanced, right? To be about 1.6 or something like that. For the entire state of Maryland, it's 1.3. So thinking about jobs housing balance by commute shed, we think is a useful way to think about, particularly when you're trying to balance and you're trying to plan for a region as large as the Baltimore metropolitan area and as the Washington metropolitan area and the state of Maryland. So to get a little technical, slightly more technical, why do these firms locate in these centers? All right. So we've done some analysis of why this occurs. All right. Economic theory suggests that firms locate in centers perhaps for one of three reasons. One is because they are located in the center of the market, and you have somewhat of these monocentric kind of phenomena going on. The second may be because centers arise at transportation nodes, right? Again, because of accessibility. And third, because of centers offering location and agglomeration economies, right? And in a group where we're talking about economics and planning, it probably makes some sense to think about that, and everybody understands the terms. So location economics is generally thought to be the benefits of firms locating from other firms in the same industry. Right? So if the entire industry, a particular medical industry, for example, all locate together because they're all in the same industry, that's location economics. But firms also benefit from proximity to other firms. Right? We call it urbanization economics, urbanization economies, so that firms need to locate not only near other firms in the same industry, but they like to locate near firms that are in other industries as well. So to test that, all right, we did some econometric analysis. Right? And we estimated a very simple equation where the dependent variable is the number of new firms that were born between 2007 and 2009. And we looked at how many firms were born over this period within a particular TAZ, within a particular industrial sector, where N number represents the number of firms per acre, and U represents the number of firms in all industries, and L represents the number of firms in the same industries, and C is everything else. All right? So if we're looking for urbanization economies, we're looking at the coefficient on U, and we're looking for localization economies, we're looking at the coefficient on L. So to do this, the specification of this model, we did this for 4 sectors: construction, professional, administrative, and fire, finance, insurance, and real estate. We estimated this using Tobit estimation, which is a combination of dichotomous and continuous dependent variables. The reason we needed to do that is because there were a lot of TAZs that had no births of no new firms, so you have a lot of zeros as dependent variables. And then we specified the model in 2 ways, really. Multiple ways, but 2 that I'm going to talk about. Right? The first is we looked simply at the relationship between the number of new firms born and the total number of jobs in the TAZ. Very simple specification, plus all the control variables. The second, we looked at total jobs and industry jobs in the TAZ. Right? So we're trying to tease out not only the urbanization economies as well as the localization economies. The problem with that specification, however, is that the total number of jobs and the number of jobs in a specific industry were highly correlated. Remember that I showed you that most of these centers were really quite industrially diverse. So big centers tended to have more firms and more employment in every industry. So if we increase the number of total employees in an industry, we also increase the number of firms within a particular industry. So the way we tried to get around that was to look at total number of jobs as an independent variable, as well as the share of industry jobs in the TAZ, right? And the share, therefore, not being as highly correlated with the total number of jobs. So we estimated these models for the 4 industries. And I'm going to spare you the gory details on all the econometric equations and the coefficients and T statistics and so forth. But here's essentially what we got. All right, so when we did this estimation in the construction sector, we found that there was greater job birth. New firm growth was greater in TAZs with more total jobs. All right, so yes, places where there are a lot of jobs already, we expect to see more firm growth, and a higher share of jobs in the construction industry. So evidence of both urbanization economies as well as localization economies. We also found that the birth of firms in the construction industry also increased with proximity to interstate freeways. Right? This is not too surprising either, because the construction industry tends to be more automobile-oriented than it tends to be transit-oriented, except that it also was bus stops. Remember what I said about the difference between high-income folks and low-income folks and their proclivity to ride transit versus riding bus, and this is part of the reason why. When we did this in the administrative sector, we found new firm growth greater in TAZs with more total jobs, once again, more evidence of urbanization economies, but not so much on the administrative sector. Right? So this is a case where both the number of jobs and the share of jobs in the administration sector didn't seem to lend itself to new firm births, at least within this particular time period. They were also attracted to TAZs with lower property values and to TAZs that had a metro station. When we did this in the fire sector, we found new firm growth greater in TAZs with more total jobs, more share of jobs in the fire sector, lower property values, and proximity to interstate freeways. Once again, evidence of urbanization economies as well as localization economies. A little surprised about the interstate freeways in this particular case, but don't forget that the real economic engine in the state of Maryland is the 270 corridor, right, of which the 270 freeway runs directly up it. So this is an area where the fire sector is quite large. And finally, in the professional services sector, we found new firm growth greater in TAZs with more total jobs, with more jobs, with the higher share of jobs in the professional services sector, with less congestion measured in travel time, and ones that had a metro station. So this was an industry that really came out nicely. So we found evidence of urbanization economies. We found evidence of localization economies. We found evidence that employment growth was not stimulated, was retarded by congestion, and that access to metro was really important for the growth of firms in this particular industry. So to conclude, what do we conclude from all this? First of all, we found that a considerable share of employment in Maryland is concentrated in a small number of economic centers. This is perhaps not news, but I think this is a different way of thinking about economic centers than most planners think about when they think about walkable urban environments. A considerable share of transit trips in Maryland end in the same economic centers. All right, so if you're thinking about transit, why do people take transit? They take transit mostly to get to work. It's more efficient to get to work by transit if you concentrate those jobs within particular centers. So, concentration of economic growth in Maryland economic centers, we argue, is likely to yield increases in agglomeration and localization economies and fewer vehicle miles traveled. So the idea being here that economics, in fact, does inform planning and can be used to stimulate, to produce a more sustainable and equitable economic development pattern. So, to conclude further, economic analysis provides strong empirical support for plans and policies that support the growth of large and diverse centers. Right? If we're doing planning for the Baltimore metropolitan area, if we're engaged in Planned Maryland, we think these centers really ought to play an extremely prominent role in the construction of those plans. And whereas Maryland's smart growth policies strive to concentrate residential growth into compact mixed-use centers, our analysis suggests that such policies might have more beneficial economic impacts if they focused on the location of jobs more than the location of households. We've been making the argument that far too much emphasis in the state of Maryland on smart growth is focused on concentrating households within particular geographic areas, and we think the focus probably ought to be turned a little bit more to the location and the concentration of jobs. For more information, the gory details behind all these, behind this, Chengri and Yi Nu, a former student at the center, and I have a paper forthcoming in Economic Development Quarterly, and we have another one in review where we're arguing that polycentrism is a sustainable and is a sustainable development strategy for the state of Maryland. So, thank you. Yeah.
Hi. My name is Robin Lewis. I'm in the Sustainable Urban Planning Program.
Oh, great.
My graduate work.
Thank you.
But in reference to Maryland, I live in Maryland, and I've studied the priority funding areas and the smart growth policies. So you're suggesting, even though a lot of the employment centers are along in the priority funding areas, and that's the focus of their attention, should there be what difference should they tweak their policies in Maryland? Because I think the focus is driving the population along that corridor.
Here's what I think. So we know Maryland has priority funding areas, right, which is Maryland's version of growth boundaries, and there's a lot of emphasis placed on that. Right? If you've read some of my work, I don't think it works very well, quite frankly. But the focus is really, if you look at the statutes in Maryland, is really about where residential development can take place, right? And my thing is, I don't think you ignore that by any means, right? But if you look at the smart growth policies in the state of Maryland, they're almost silent with respect to employment, okay? Now, most of the employment really already is within the priority funding area, so perhaps if you're arguing that's all you care about, it doesn't matter, right? The programs that are constricted to priority funding areas by the Department of Business and Economic Development and so forth also constrain development, expenditures to be in priority funding areas. But we think they really ought to focus much more tightly on these economic centers, right? So let's provide an incentive for development in these economic centers that's even greater than being within the priority funding areas per se. That's what we're arguing. Yeah?
Aren't you saying that the economics will have it be so anyway?
I'm saying that there already is a tendency for the economics to do so, right? But there is an externality, right? Through the transportation system, right? That we can get more people on transit, right? And if we get more people on transit, we have fewer vehicle miles traveled, right? And we have less greenhouse gases, and we presumably will have more beneficial. So yes, there already is a tendency to do that. Right? Does the market somehow undervalue this? Perhaps, right? But also we have a clear externality that suggests that public policy ought to encourage it even further.
So if you have a choice of where to spend your transportation funds, for example.
Yes, right. So we just raised the transportation gas tax, as you know, right? Suddenly the MDOT is flush with money. They ought to think about how the economic development policies and the transportation policies interface so that we are concentrating economic development within growth centers and our transportation system feeds those centers. Right? And there's another institutional point I think you brought out earlier is that MDOT is over here doing its plan, MDP is over here doing its plan, and we have MDE over here doing its climate plan, and guess what? None of these are interrelated. Right? So again, this is an argument we're trying to make is to try to integrate this a little bit. Yes, please.
What does the Maryland Chamber of Commerce think about this?
I don't know. I'm going to go present this to them next week.
Good luck.
No, I think they're actually quite receptive.
Yeah, no, I meant that very genuinely.
Yeah, no, they're quite receptive to this, right? I mean, we're showing them some of this stuff. The big worry in Maryland is that Virginia's going to eat their lunch, right? And Royce knows that in Montgomery County, that's, the real concern. All the development is going to. And we wouldn't have passed our gas tax, I'm quite convinced, right, if Virginia hadn't have done it first. So we thank you very much, Virginians, if you're in here, for stimulating the passage of that.
Ron Kirby sent a letter to the Maryland State Legislature saying that.
There you go. But yeah, I mean, they're actually quite receptive. Not everybody, of course. We've got some folks out in Western Maryland who don't want anything to do with transit and so forth. But yeah, they're quite receptive. Yeah.
So how do you see the red line in Baltimore and the purple line fitting into this piece?
Well, that's a kind of a long answer, but we've actually just formed a Purple Line Coalition, right, where we're trying to do some research where we're going to we think about jobs housing balance within the corridor, right? I don't know quite as much about the red line as I do about the purple line, right? But I think, as you well know, the purple line is one of the first sort of, a suburban circumferential lines and thinking about how that interfaces. And I think it makes sense that we see the decentralization of jobs, that we get more development around these nodes. And the time to start planning for that is now, right? Is the argument that we're making. So I think it fits in quite nicely, actually. Yeah?
So you've got MDP and DBED.
Yeah.
I'm Maryland too.
Yeah.
And I have the same exact reaction, which is, wow, that's a huge insight. So are MDP and DBED talking to one another about this?
We are talking to both of them.
Right.
Are they talking? Yeah. I mean, there is something called the Smart Growth Subcabinet, right, in Maryland, as you know, and the Sustainable Growth Commission. We keep pushing it, right? And that's our job, right? And not everybody in state government likes us because sometimes we say things that they don't like to hear. But this is getting a little bit more receptive.
Because you just can't get it all by zoning. You've got to create these kinds of incentives or enactment something that changes the dynamic that we've got.
Yeah, we're working on it.
Yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
So finally, it's very fun to be able to introduce Jan Song. As I mentioned at the onset, I think of Jan as the best of my generation or cohort of planning academics. And so it's fun to have her here. She's distinguished in a lot of ways, but one little known thing about Jan is that, as far as I know anyway, she's responsible for the one photograph ever published in the Journal of Urban Economics. Is that correct? There's a photograph published in the Journal of Urban Economics. Yeah, it's probably the only one ever happened or ever will happen. Yeah, so please.
John. That's too kind of you. This with Gary and Jen here. It just reminds me like 10 years ago when I was doing my dissertation defense, and at that time, one of my best friends said, "Wow, the idea of having those two people in the same room makes me shivering." But it's really my great experience of having those great professors in my time. And so I did my training in both urban economics and urban planning. The first thing I went to, when I went to Illinois, Gary asked me to take the urban economics class from Professor Jen Brookler, so it was a great experience. Right, so I'm going to share with you, because I know it's Friday afternoon after 5 already, so I'll keep my story here short and sweet. I'm just going to share with you this one recent project I was doing, which is on infrastructure and urban development from Chinese cities. Let me just show you some pictures just to impress you, right? So this is a snapshot of one area in any Chinese city, and this is in 1985. All right, at the time you see it's just pretty much still just the rice paddies. Not much infrastructure was put in there. Okay, this is 1985. 1995, you see the roads being put in, some infrastructure, I mean, mostly the infrastructure system being put in. All right, 10 years later, you see all this private investment, all this real estate housing developments, as well as right in the middle, the civic building being put in. And just another picture of the municipal building. Another picture, another snapshot. Okay, so within 20 years of just think about the time frame when this was happening. Another one. Okay, this is in city of Shenzhen. This is late 80s. As you can see here, it's just a salt plant with some oyster farming areas. Not much going on because this is the ocean, right? 10 years later, right, they claimed the land from the ocean and putting all this infrastructure. This is an expressway, okay? And lots of, again, infrastructure accordingly, consequentially, the private and public investment being pushed into the area. Another snapshot, okay, in 85, nothing is going on, but then since then they are putting a lot of infrastructure, and then just barely 10 years later, okay, the Yantian port, which is now the second largest port in Asia. Okay, just a picture showing you just for that spot. All right, so this is what I want to share with you in terms of, again, economics and planning. Jen mentioned that planning has been used to do regulations, right? But in the case of China, planning has been used as a growth machine in many places. In this case, planning has been used as putting into infrastructure, planning infrastructure and attracting and stimulating both economic and population both in many ways. So, and there's a saying that if you need to eat developed, put in infrastructure first. Okay, that's what the planners are saying in China. So the motivation of this one is just to show you if that's true. If with all this money put in, for example, just between 2011 and 2015, it's proposed that more than $1 trillion will be put in across China for infrastructure construction. Okay, so is this going to be the case? Is this going to be the case that using infrastructure to attract more growth? In this case, sort of urban spatial expansion and price gain in land. Another snapshot just showing you here that infrastructure investment as the proportion of total investment or as the percentage of GDP has really been sort of incrementally increasing over the past of couple of decades. Okay. All right. So this is this is the economics coming in. Basically, the Ministry of Urban and Rural Development in China asked a group of scholars, including myself, just to see, to evaluate if this sort of infrastructure planning idea has actually succeeded in stimulating urban growth. So I'm going just to present you two sets of empirical evidences here. The first one is just to see how, by studying a cross-sectional of 657 cities, just to see how, if the different levels of infrastructure brought into sort of different levels of urban expansion and land prices. And then secondly, I will show you just specific one case study, a time series study to show you the effects of urban infrastructure. Okay, so the first part is to empirically testing how infrastructure provision contributes to different levels of urban expansion and the land price. I am going to spare you all the details in terms of the theoretical model. It's based on model-centric model, and because China, I mean, most of Chinese cities are still developing, so it's a consolidated, open and closed model-centric model, allowing for some flow of population across the cities and so on. But I'm going to spare you that details. The details is contained in this article. So I'm going to use urban scale, basically the land area of cities, as the dependent variable, as one of the dependent variables. And the second line, the land price, is another variable. And here, remembering that my main focus is to look at the infrastructure's influence. So I'm having a range of infrastructure variables, including bus, streets, highways, railway centers, okay, airports, and the total, sort of a total percentage of infrastructure investment comparing to GDP. I mean, all those variables are used to look at how levels of infrastructure varied across those 657 cities. Then have some other control variables. It's typical in the model-centric model. You have population, income, agricultural land value, and for the land price equation, also have the lagged price variable there, and the supply of land, basically the availability of land as control. Also, some variables controlling for different types of cities. If it's sort of a more politically important to have more gain in terms of sort of a visibility, sort of a capital city or a prefectural city, and so on. All right, let's just see some of the results here. There are two sets of results here. One is for urban scale, urban expansion, and the other one is for land price. Let me just spare you the details here in terms of the coefficients or T statistics and so on. Let me just jump into the key findings here. So essentially, the results shown that both transportation investments, okay, in this case, both the intra or inter-city transportation investments and both the transit and private transportation investments, I mean, such as expressway and so on, have really positive impacts on urban expansion, meaning that when you have more infrastructure put into the cities, it causes the city to urbanize further, to expand more. And keep in mind that the policy of urbanization is really one of the sort of a top, almost the top one important national policy now in China. The current urbanization rate is just past 50%. It's 50.5% this year, and the projection is going to 65% by the next 15 years, right? And it went from like 17% in the late 70s. So you can see that, I mean, essentially the planners and the policymakers are really using this infrastructure policy to induce more urbanization, higher level urbanization, in this case reflected in terms of urban expansion. All right, let's look at the picture of land price gains. Much of the amenities, unfortunately, provided by the planners in terms of the intra-city amenities, such as more streets, more buses, and so on, has not been capitalized into land prices. Okay, although the intercity infrastructure, mainly in this case the airport, the capacity of the airport has been capitalized, and the potential explanation is that first of all, when cities grow, lots of in this case, lots of land has been subsidized, has been leased out to the developers at subsidized price, and that's not really reflecting the true market value of the land, right? Because again, the policymakers, the officials want to attract, for example, Walmart to come in. They basically just gave out the land at a really cheaper price to attract the developments. And another note here is that in this case, it coincides with Gary's point here. It does have an income implication here. Higher income people who would travel more across cities by taking the air traffic, and that part is really reflected into the land price differentiation across the cities. Okay, but lots of rural to urban migrants who are mainly taking the buses or the rail transportation. That part is not really capitalized into land prices because they're mostly lower income people working in the sort of a lower value added manufacturing sectors. Right. So in short, for those both for the urban expansion and land prices, you will see again the role that the infrastructure played in this process. All right, and then let me show you just looking at one city. Okay, just one case study here. I've shown you this picture before from Shenzhen. Right. One argument would be that in this kind of typical study is that would infrastructure be put in where you can anticipate that developments would happen anyway, right? So this is typical traditional argument here. But using city of Shenzhen as example could avoid this kind of sort of urban typical economics or econometric issue here. So I took the remote sensing data at different time points. And in this case, specifically, it's between 1994 and 2005. So through this remote sensing data set, I was able to identify those red areas. Basically, those red areas was identified as land conversions, being as the more and the new urbanized land being converted during that period, right? And in this case, is farmland being converted to urban use, or other sort of land with natural vegetation being converted into urban land use. So you see they're scattered around in the city. The port is just right in the ocean, the example that I show you. Okay. And so in this case, we did probability analysis. Okay, we just want to see if the adjacency or proximity to the infrastructure has incurred or induced sort of higher probability of land conversion into urban uses. Okay, and again, in this case, as I showed you, in late 80s or early 90s, there were nothing, they're rice paddies. So people just didn't know where the urban land use was going to be converted. So it's sort of avoiding that issue of, where it's going to have urban development. That's why you put in infrastructure. And sort of avoiding that kind of econometric issue. Okay, very shortly. Basically, this whole set of analysis showed that the adjacency to both the existing roads or the newly added roads and subway as well, and the amount of infrastructure in terms of the density of infrastructure as well. Those four key infrastructure variables all turned out to be significant, meaning that there's an increasing probability of attracting private investments, thus the urban land conversion due to the greater level of urban infrastructure. Okay. All right. So this is sort of what economics tell you, right? The infrastructure is inducing more developments, but if this is enough, I mean that's a question here, and that's the planning question, right? And now I want to show you some thoughts from planners. Okay, are they sustainable, right? Just basically, first of all, are they equitable, right? The infrastructure investment showed a great amount of regional inequality, right? Just in coastal areas or the west or central, the other parts of China. And you probably all see, you know, I mean, every single iPads or iPhones that you have is made in the eastern part. It's the firm called Foxconn. Okay, that's in the east area of China. Although very recently, what they call develop the West, right, revitalize the old industrial bases could turn out to be different. As a matter of fact, Foxconn is moving from the east to the west just this year, moving a large complex of their factory to those western areas. And you also see that about 850 kilometers of subway system is put in just across China in many Chinese cities, but 95 of those are still in eastern part of China. So you see this sort of a regional inequality in terms of infrastructure planning. Another big thing here in terms of financing sources, I've shown you that the infrastructure is not really increasing up the land prices through my results presented earlier. As a matter of fact, the local financing platform that is a big concern now. Basically, they're 20%. That number could be higher. Could be more than 25% of total number of local government are bearing higher than 100% of a debt ratio, just because of a lot of investment being put into the infrastructure. But they're not really not much availability in terms of alternatives of financing. Right? Property tax is not there yet. Land value capture and this kind of financing tool is not ready. Although there could be some pilot cases, but mostly they're not ready there. Right? And again, from planner's point of view, when you put into this infrastructure, you see again really auto-oriented, really wide streets, not really walkable, right? And this is just a snapshot of one central business district planned in a city called Zhengzhou, and you can see that it's just like any American city, and it's not really walkable or bringing up a lot of, I mean, definitely not the walk-up place that Chris talked about earlier. And in terms of subway, okay, you're putting a lot of, more than 800 kilometers of subway, but this is one typical case. This really high-rise and high-end commercial housing developments is right in the sort of the adjacent to the entrance of subway station. But high-income people, I mean, living there, not really taking the subway station. I mean, one survey that I did, I mean, basically 2% of people there living there are taking the subway to work. Right? Lack of coordination. Okay, that's another planning problem. Another picture. This is Shanghai's high-speed railway station. Really modernized, beautiful, but it's not really connected to other modes where you can take off the train and then go to the city without taking the car or other private type of infrastructure. Although there is a reversing trend that we can see. A lot of has been called for in terms of promoting green cities, low carbon cities, or transit metropolis. I mean, those are hot words, civil police running around in China, calling for just a better and sustainable environment. So the question is, do we have more economic tools designed to develop this type of green or sustainable communities we want? Carbon taxation was just talked about last week, and 2 cities, Shanghai and Shenzhen, are going to take carbon taxation as one of the tools that they want to use to promote low carbon cities, rather than just relying on this sort of physical side of story, putting in infrastructure. So we'll see any kind of changes or new development in terms of this. Again, using economic tools to have better developments. Okay. So that's the story that I want to share with you here. In a nutshell, I think both economics and planning are needed, are necessary to have this sustainable communities. Okay, thank you. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is John Bondato. I'm also a student here at GW in urban planning. I was wondering if you'd mind commenting maybe on the role of public-private partnerships in infrastructure development, and whether or not it's been successful in bridging the financing gap and perhaps sharing some of the risk that's been attributed and these debts are incurred by local governments, and whether or not they've been successful in mitigating that.
Yeah, good question. In terms of PPP, I had a slide that I deleted. I can share you more information later. It's increasing. It's sort of as the percentage of financing infrastructure is increasing in the past couple of years, but it's just really very increasing. But I'm sure that would be a more efficient way of financing the system. Yeah. Yes.
So we know that the infrastructure investment encourages development that might not happen, or at least conversions.
Right.
And then there's the debt that's related to that. Do we know is there any way to get at, or have you gotten at, whether the returns from the development are sufficient to pay for the infrastructure? So that's the economic sustainability question for that.
Yeah, great question. Currently, I don't see that return is really sufficient to cover that part. That's why there's a worry about this local debt. Yeah, definitely there's a worry about that, and it really worried most of policymakers in China in terms of sustainability of the economy there. I mean, that's why, again, value capture, using the increments from land price, right, due to the infrastructure investment, is really being designed as pilot cases in some places. But that's really just very beginning, right? You're definitely right. There's worry about that lack of returns.
It's possible that the government builds infrastructure in places that it expects to grow, and therefore that you have a simultaneity problem in your empirical work. So you must have thought about that a bit.
Yes.
So what's your answer?
The answer was to, I could do like more formal econometric sort of specifications to solve it, to handle this problem. But in this case, we did ask a sample of more than 55 cities in terms of asking them when they put in the infrastructure plan, what were their considerations. And mostly because again, you got to understand this speed of urbanization in Chinese cities. It's growing from 17% to all of a sudden 50%. So you could not really anticipate where the development would happen, right? Just for this simultaneity problem. So most planners just thought, okay, this is the new area. This is like really for the reason of having a huge site. Okay, for the reason why more than, for example, 20 square kilometers. For the reason of that, we want to put in this infrastructure to develop that whole new district of the city, where nothing was going on there. So just from that, I think it took care of some of the simultaneity problem that you were referring to. Yes.
You mentioned towards the latter part of your presentation interest in low carbon urban development.
Right.
Everything you've shown us seems to point to a lock-in factor of an urban form that has been built up over the last 20, 30 years, which in fact will make it very difficult to reverse the trend of high auto use and so on. So I was wondering if there's been any attempt at calculating the negative externalities in terms of environmental impact, carbon emissions of this kind of urban model, and incorporating that into attempts at redesigning, or at least in going forward, given that the urbanization wave has not finished far from it, what kind of changes you see might be happening in that sense?
Yeah, great question. So there were a couple of really great academic pieces done by scholars in China, just calculating the loss. In this case, for example, the public health loss from air quality, for example, PM 2.5. This is really big. Fine particular matter, right? It's just like very tiny pollutant that can be increased into lungs. It was really big. Earlier this year, Beijing suffered from it. So a couple of scholars really calculate that in terms of loss in the medical bill, for example, in public health, and they calculate the number of that resulted from from excessive commuting, thus the car emissions, the vehicle emissions out from this kind of urban form, right? There were a couple of, I don't have the numbers top of my head, but yes, there are a couple of calculations on that. And because of that, I think the things are really changing. At least at the top level, the central level government, there's really a push for this whole idea of low carbon city development or green city development. So I'm pretty sure that more policy instruments would be designed to address this carbon emission problem. Yes.
Given the extent of the rural-urban migration that's occurring in China, are there places where urbanization has occurred ahead of the infrastructure being available?
Great comment. My view is definitely yes. Urbanization in many places using infrastructure as this sort of bait for development. I think it's definitely getting ahead. My other study, which is looking at the recovery area of Wenchuan earthquake that happened in 2008, right? Basically the local governments and the central government as well is using that recovery process to expedite the urbanization process. It's a hinterland of Sichuan province, which is quite sort of a lack of development region before, but now it's all this infrastructure and all those new urban developments being put in. In that sense, urbanization rate is not really matching up with the you can say the proportion of people working in the economic sectors. It's not really matching up with that.
Have you been able to study the different types of infrastructure that are implemented? I thought your case study was really interesting in that infrastructure might drive development, different infrastructure in different ways, and then it might not even be useful to that population. For example, some green infrastructure like transit not being utilized. So have you been able to look at that relationship between infrastructure development and then its utility?
Yeah, it's a great idea. I haven't got to that part yet. Yeah, but it's a great idea to look at more closely. Yes.
You mentioned that there are no property tax.
Yes.
So then how does local government fund for the public service and finance themselves?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, property tax has been experimented just in 3 pilot cases, 3 pilot cities now. But so far, land is used as the the sort of the financing tour. Essentially, the local government is leasing out the land to developers for the next 20 or 50 years of fixed amount of time, right? And that is really driving because the existing government wants to have more revenue from land leasing. And to some extent, that's really not a sustainable financing tour because it just promotes the local officials to lease out land more than is necessary and to encourage more of this type of developments.
Well, I want to thank personally each of our speakers today. I mean it when I say there would be no sustainable urban planning program without you, this group in particular. I thank all of you for coming. I think outside there's a party waiting for us. So please visit, mix it up, and enjoy. Thank you.